In gaming, and especially for our purposes when it comes to hero shooters, there's an interesting phenomenon of certain characters being labeled as girls' characters, like characters for girls, not just characters that are girls. By extension, those also frequently get labeled as gay characters for a lot of similar reasons, although the gays also sometimes diverge in some curious ways. Mercy is a girls' hero in Overwatch and also a gay hero by extension, but Symmetra or Sombra are for the gay boys. Zarya is assumed to be for the lesbians, but I personally think they go more for Ana. Genji's for the straight boys unless it's time to start making fan art. You'd think Venture's for the NBs, but actually they get Bastion. You get the picture. It's hard to pin down exactly what makes a certain character a girl's character or a gay's character, though. I mean, there's obviously stereotypes that play into it. Femininity often gets linked to playing support. Masculinity is linked to playing more active damage-dealing roles, stuff like that. And this goes a step further for marginalized people too. Gay men will often recategorize these characters as top and bottom characters instead of masculine or feminine characters, often along very similar lines. Bottoms play Mercy, tops play Genji. However, ultimately, this is all just stereotyping and assumption. We don't really know what the data is here, because even if games like Overwatch and Marvel Rivals allowed you to see everyone's career profiles without any being made private, they don't collect demographic data that would be useful for our purposes here. Overwatch can't tell me what proportion of Sombra players are bottoms, and Marvel Rivals can't tell me what proportion of Spider-Man players are straight boys who weren't loved enough. If we want to answer the question of who do the girls, gays, and theys main and why, we'll have to figure that out independently. And that's just what I did. I surveyed my audience to see if we can deduce if there's any truth to these stereotypes, and if so, why they tend to pick the characters they pick. Before we get fully into it, 3 quick things. First, this video is long and there's a lot going on, so I would ask that you hold comments until the end, since the format of this video will mean that any hot takes formed halfway through are more than likely to be addressed in later segments. Second, this is one of 2 videos being released simultaneously, with the companion video being How Queerness Moved from Horror to Healer, which focuses more on sociological stuff and cultural connotations. If you're interested in this subject, make sure to go check that one out when you're done here. Finally, time is running out to pre-order the Viv Wiggler pins. The campaign will end on September 5th, and we're only a few pre-orders away from the campaign succeeding, so if you want one, make sure to place your pre-order. This is especially the case for Americans because thanks to the tariff policy of the United States, the shipping company that Aeria, the person who makes the pins, uses will no longer be shipping to the US directly for the foreseeable future. We're going to be doing a workaround for the pre-orders where she'll ship them to me and then I'll get them to Americans who ordered them on my own dime, but since I'll be taking on that extra cost myself, I'm only going to be doing it for pre-orders. In other words, if you're an American who wants a Wiggler pin, it'll have to be a pre-order unless tariffs suddenly change up. For everyone else, pre-orders will still be handled as normal, so make sure to get them in ASAP so the campaign can succeed and you can get one of these cute little guys. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into the video properly, starting with Part 1. The Methodology. So, like any good study, or in this case, any unsanctioned pilot study, we should probably start out with an explanation of how I went about collecting this data. This is the 3rd study video I've done on this channel, with the first coming out in 2023 and focusing on the Dunning-Kruger effect among Overwatch players, and the second coming out in 2024 and focusing on whether or not it's possible to gaslight people into changing their opinions on balance. Both videos are linked in the cards in the top right if you're curious and haven't seen them yet, but the main reason for bringing them up here is that they actually presented the first real challenge for this study, namely, that I have made a habit of lying to people in the name of science. Now to be clear, you are allowed to lie to your subjects in a study if it's actually necessary for the study's purposes. It's very common to lie by omission, at least to some extent. When you're conducting a study, you don't want people to filter themselves or their responses based on what they think you're looking for, so you often can't explain the full purposes of the study up front. This isn't always the case. If your study revolves around gathering information about people who have a specific experience, such as people who have been in car accidents and suffered head injuries as a result, you need to tell people up front that that's what you're looking for so they know what, to bring to the table, what is relevant to you. Failing to do so means that you'll probably end up with a sample population that matches the general population more than your target one, and while working in a public-facing position might have you thinking otherwise, there is a statistically low percentage of the general public that suffered brain damage from a car accident. However, if you're looking for a control group, you might want to keep it vague. In my 2 previous studies, I lied by saying that I was doing a survey on how accurate the Overwatch ranked system was, and that I was doing a survey on how people reacted to different people's beliefs about character rankings in terms of strength. In both cases, I needed to make sure I got people from a wide range of skill levels, so I didn't want to make it too specific. And if I had told them the truth, that the survey was about the Dunning-Kruger effect or was explicitly based on lies, respectively, then it would have skewed the responses and made the results inaccurate. However, a downside of this is that it meant people were a lot more skeptical of my intentions this time than in the past. When I asked people to fill out the survey, they'd joke about how I was tricking them this time, which meant that my past actions will have skewed how this survey was perceived for some people. To counteract that, I did my best to explain myself clearly and construct questions in a way that made it less likely that people would feel the need to twist their answers. The format of the survey was as follows. First, I asked people to give me some demographic data. age, gender, sexuality, and position if they felt comfortable disclosing that. This data has all been anonymized and decoupled from any identifiers, and that was also stressed to respondents, since the goal is to avoid anyone lying. And sometimes people lie to cover up insecurities, or just something that they're still in the closet about if they think it'll be exposed. Next, respondents were asked if they had played Overwatch, and if they said no, they got bumped to the third section of the study. For people who said yes, they were asked to give some details about the characters they play. I asked them to rank the roles from their most to least favorite, and then asked them to list their first, second, and third most played heroes, as well as which character they would identify as their main, and which character they consider to be their favorite, however they choose to define that. From there, I gave them a bunch of statements about various character attributes and asked them to tell me how much those attributes affect their decision to play a character, where they'd respond with a 3 to say that they felt neutral about a particular aspect of a character, 5 to say it made them really want to play that character, and 1 to say it made them really not want to play that character. The statements ranged from the character is a woman, or the character is queer, to the character is what I would describe as a girl boss, or the character is what I would describe as a boy failure. Some of these were obviously pretty silly, and I'll put them all up on screen now to pause and review if you'd like to. We'll go over the responses in more detail in a sec, but the goal was to see if certain groups were more or less motivated to play a character based on any number of individual personality factors. Importantly, I did not ask about playstyle, and I'll explain why in a sec. After this, respondents were asked if they'd played Marvel Rivals. If they said no, they got bumped to the end of the survey. If they said yes, then they got asked the same basic questions about the most played heroes, mains, and favorites, and then the girl boss questions. After that, they got to the end of the survey as well and submitted it. Now, some issues with this. My goal here was to see if personal identifiers, specifically on gender, sexuality, and position, correlate with identifiers associated with the characters people gravitate towards. This is why all the questions relate to characteristics of characters, either in terms of identities that they hold or ways to describe them, instead of gameplay mechanics. The reason for this is because personally I think it's just more compelling to ask about the identity side of things when it comes to this particular question, but also because of what I mentioned before about the lying. I didn't want to risk this study getting tainted by people thinking that this was another evaluation where they were being lied to in a way that might reflect their skills or perception being bad or wrong. Focusing on the entirely personal and subjective meant that I would hopefully be able to trust these responses more, which in turn would mean that they would be more useful. There's also the implications that come with asking these questions in combination with one another. A question like, do gay men prefer to play girl bosses or boy failures, is ultimately a pretty harmless one. Asking, do women prefer to play easier characters, is a significantly more loaded one that requires way more nuance than the survey was capable of handling given its scope. It would have required a much larger sample size than I was able to guarantee that I could access, and I think if that was how the questions were framed, a lot of people would have dropped out of the survey because they felt like it was going in a girls play easy heroes while boys play harder heroes direction. People don't like being part of surveys where they feel like the intention is to drag them. It's a big part of why I had to lie previously in the Dunning-Kruger study, and while that's unavoidable in some instances, I wanted to make my best effort to extract useful information here and try to identify trends rather than getting bogged down in questions that this study wouldn't have been able to effectively engage with to begin with. Maybe it's for future study, or maybe it's for someone who's actually able to explore these topics in an academic setting, but it's not for this video. And you might say, you can ask about gameplay without asking about difficulty, but you really kinda can't. The implication is truly always gonna be there. If I ask, so, do you play Mercy for the gameplay? The implication will be that I'm actually asking, do you play her because she's easy? Because that's how people tend to frame Mercy, which can incentivize people to either quit the survey or change their responses out of either defensiveness or embarrassment. Some questions become impossible to ask neutrally due to social context, whether in a niche environment like Overwatch and Rivals or a broader social context. This is especially true when the literal answer is obvious, because it implies a deeper question that I'm trying to get you to answer, and you're going to try and answer that question, not just the explicit one. If I ask you, do you think Serena Williams is good at tennis? You would obviously answer yes to the explicit question, because she objectively is. The idea of answering no to that is just an assumption that you must be trolling. There's no way to sincerely believe she's bad at tennis. However, if I'm asking you such an obvious question, would you not begin to wonder why? What information I think that I can derive from your response? Maybe you'll assume that I'm trying to get 100% of people to say she's good, which I could then interpret as people understanding she's the undisputed GOAT. Or maybe, given the questions about demographics, you would interpret it as me trying to see if there's a gender disparity in those responses. The thing about how a certain percentage of men think they could definitely take a point off of Serena Williams in a tennis match. Same goes for asking questions about gameplay. Obviously, if you're playing a character, their actual gameplay is going to be a factor. It is unavoidable for it to be a factor in a video game. It is an inherently interactive medium, and we're talking about games where gameplay is kind of the whole deal. And so, if I ask about it, there will be an assumption that, do you enjoy Mercy for her gameplay, is a question that's asking something else implicitly, and that can lead to inconsistent responses that aren't entirely helpful. Contextually, these explicit and implicit questions can't really be divorced from one another. At least not in a study where I'm not interviewing every respondent one-on-one. Any question that would try to get an answer regarding gameplay would either run into those obstacles or would be so vague that the answers wouldn't be helpful given the format. Remember, these were all agree/disagree questions on a scale from 1 to 5. Anyways, so this is how this worked. This was the format of the survey itself, which I began soliciting responses for on June 9th, 2025, from YouTube, Twitch, Discord, and Twitter. The survey was closed at the end of the day on June 22nd, 2025, with 162 responses. There were actually thousands, but that's because there was an error where a bunch of bot responses, I guess, got registered, which was really cool and fun, and I loved having to deal with that. The survey asked for responses on 3 aspects of a person's identity: gender, sexuality, and position. On gender, the options provided were trans men, cis women, cis women, and non-binary people, plus an option to write in a response. On sexuality, the options provided were homosexual, in brackets gay/lesbian, heterosexual, in brackets straight, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, two-spirit, and an option to write in a response. On position, the options provided were top, bottom, verse, side, and in brackets straight, as well as an option for queer people who didn't feel comfortable responding. Some of these options will not be used for this study, primarily because if there is a group with only a single respondent, or no respondents in a lot of cases, then it isn't super constructive. Some of these options also were never really intended to be included as a group for the purposes of this study, like the one about queer people who didn't feel comfortable answering, because that's not a super definitive group of people. It doesn't tell us anything about a demographic. That just sort of is a group of people opting out from providing that data. Now, something else to mention is that this is a challenge to actually present data for, because once you have 3 separate data points, in this case gender, sexuality, and position, you suddenly can't just present it in a simple graph anymore. Instead, we're going to have to modify things here a little bit. The way this will work is that data will be presented in a few different formats depending on what we're looking at. We can pick a specific group, i.e. homosexuals, and see their preferred roles and characters as well as their responses to all the questions. For the questions regarding roles and characters, they're color-coded relative to one another. Green is the highest percentage present, red is the lowest, and the midpoint will be yellow. In other words, green means a lot of people responded that way, while red means it was less common. You'll also be able to see the number of people in each group who responded, so if you sometimes see a really high percentage somewhere, it's worth checking to see if maybe it's because there's like 3 respondents in that group, and that might mean that one respondent responding one way gives them much more sway than half a dozen people responding in a more popular category. For the questions about whether various factors were positively or negatively polarizing, respondents answered on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 meaning that it strongly disincentivized them to play the character, 5 meaning it strongly incentivized them to play the character, and 3 meaning they were neutral about it. Something worth mentioning is that in basically every instance, the response average is pretty close to a 3. Most people consider most factors to be fairly neutral, so here's how we're going to do this. Purple will represent any response at or below a 2.25. Pink represents anything above a 2.25 to 2.5. Red represents anything above 2.5 to 2.75. Orange represents anything above 2.75 to 3.0. Yellow is anything above 3.0 to 3.25. Green is anything above 3.25 to 3.5. Cyan is anything above 3.5 to 3.75, and blue is anything above a 3.75. The way each of these numbers is calculated is by taking averages of each group. For example, in the Overwatch group, there are 10 trans men. For each question we evaluate, we'll be taking the responses of all 10 trans men, adding them together, and then dividing them by 10. We'll go through each intersecting group and do the same thing. The only exceptions to this will be questions about preferred roles and preferred heroes, since those require a bit more wiggling. For them, instead of doing intersectional analysis of the groups and the subgroups, we'll just look at each individual group on each question, and go based on the percentage of each group which selected each option. We will also occasionally pull up demographic-specific sheets that show how a single group responded to everything all in one place, like I mentioned, but those are more just for ease of access since those sheets don't have a lot of the necessary context on them. Another important piece of context is that the terminology of this survey leaves something to be desired for sure. Tops, bottoms, and verse are pretty limiting, and when I was making this survey, I was pretty naively just thinking about queer men in this context. Obviously, this was dumb, because I was asking a pretty wide range of people about this, and the terminology doesn't necessarily carry over to every group, or at least it's more complicated than that. What's more, positioning asexuality as something that is mutually exclusive with heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality, or pansexuality was also an error. Not only are asexuality and aromanticism separate concepts, but neither of those are mutually exclusive with being gay or straight or whatever else. There was also a lack of nuance in some of this terminology. Non-binary identities are a pretty giant umbrella that all got lumped together here, and while top, bottom, and verse are a thing, there's more of a gradient between them than 3 distinct identities. As well, the survey did not incorporate one big piece of demographic information: race. I went back and forth on including it as a question, but the main reason I didn't is that it would not only create too many subgroups within this one study to be able to analyze them effectively, but also that it's a subject that would require its own specific video rather than being lumped in with this one. Anyway, this has been a lot of setup, so let me just establish one more thing before we start about how this will be structured. The next section, part 2, is going to be about the Overwatch results. Then part 3 will get to the rivals results, and part 4 will be where I present some conclusions and arguments about this whole study. In addition, I will remind you that there is a companion video that came out alongside this one that gets more into a sociological analysis of these concepts and their broader cultural implications on a more narrative level. So if this is a subject you're interested in, you can find even more about it there. Anyways, this is taking forever and I'm eager to show you all the spreadsheets I worked so hard on, so let's get into it properly. Part 2. Let's talk Overwatch. So, the way we'll do this is we'll start with the role preferences, then hero preferences, and then we'll do a quick run through of the polarization responses and touch on the more interesting results I think we got from them. When it comes to Overwatch, something that might surprise you is that support was the most preferred role across all demographics except for tops, who picked tank for some reason, and was the majority preference for all other groups except for heterosexuals. That means men, women, and NBs, and straights, gays, bis, aces, and pans were all broadly on the same page in this survey on the question. A whopping 63% of all respondents picked support, compared to just 19% for DPS and 18% for tank. For second preference, we also see something interesting. Namely, no real strong feelings in any particular direction. The highest amount of agreement in this round was asexuals picking tank at 50%, but everything else was below that. Only 26% of respondents answered support here, but remember, nearly 2/3 of all respondents had already selected support by this point, so that means that 90% of respondents put support in their top 2. Mostly. Some people don't know how to follow instructions and ranked multiple roles at the same level, which is really fun. Thanks, guys. Anyways, DPS was the most picked answer for second preference across all groups except asexuals, although it was tied for most picked with tank for pansexuals. 41% of respondents picked DPS in total, with 32% picking tank and 26% picking support. This leaves us with the absolutely shocking news that, across all 3 roles, tank was just shy of 50% of all respondents' least favorite role. Only 2 groups broke with this trend, with tops picking support as their least favorite and pansexuals picking DPS by a pretty massive margin. Every other group put tank as their least favorite, with cis women, pansexuals versus homosexuals and bisexuals all holding that as the majority perspective. Heterosexuals incidentally had a tie between DPS and tank for this one, which is kind of surprising to me. The immediate takeaway here for me is that there's actually a lot more consensus than I would have expected. The stereotype has been that women play support more, and men play DPS more, and people who hate themselves play tank more. And yet, the breakdown on the roles was pretty consistent across all groups. What's more, the groups that were the exception to the trend, tops, asexuals, and pansexuals, were 3 of the 5 smallest groups in the study, with 7, 24, and 11 respondents respectively. 24 is not a small group, I guess, but still relatively small compared to some of the other ones, I guess. Smaller groups tend to get their averages skewed pretty dramatically by outliers compared to other groups, which is part of why it's important to get a big sample size, and why, sometimes you have to take it with a grain of salt when a smaller sample size yields some pretty dramatic results. Regardless, you might be wondering, okay, well, they prefer these roles, but what do they actually play? And, well, place your bets. Who's the most played hero for any given group? You might be thinking, that's kind of a lot to ask. There's 13 different demographic groups in this study. Just give me a second to think. And I actually will not do that because the answer is Mercy. Like, almost across the board. The only group that did not have her as their most played hero was, somewhat hilariously, heterosexuals. Across every gender identity, every other sexuality, and every position, Mercy ran the table here. Admittedly, with tops, it was a 7-way tie as none of them could agree on anything, but still. Overall, just shy of 30% of respondents had her as their most played, ranging from 69% of cis women to 16% of trans women. Other notable picks are homosexuals picking Symmetra at the highest rate of any group with more than 7 people, Ana being a strong favorite, and Ashe, Bastion, Doomfist, Echo, Freya, Sojourn, Torbjorn, Venture, and Wrecking Ball having nil points. Now, important to remember for this kind of question that time is an unavoidable bias here. If you've played from day 1 of Overwatch 1, you likely have dozens of hours on heroes that you played a decade ago and have rarely touched since. And think Mercy is still in my top 3 because I used to play her constantly during the Moth meta of 2017. Older heroes, particularly supports, given how thin the roster is for them, will inevitably end up being played more on average than newer ones. It's probably why Freya, given that she was brand new when this survey happened, wasn't being picked as much as, say, Mercy, who's been there forever. Out of the 9 heroes that had nobody pick them as their most played, only 2 of them, Bastion and Torbjorn, have been there from the start, with 4 being Overwatch 1 DLC heroes, Ashe, Doomfist, Echo, and Wrecking Ball, with the remaining 3, Freya, Sojourn, and Venture, being Overwatch 2 heroes. Also, I can feel some people feeling particularly smug about their group maybe having a lower portion of Mercy players, so let me just disabuse that notion real quick with the second and third round preferences. Mercy was the most played across every group, ranging from the low end with heterosexuals only being at 20% and cis women on the high end at more than 80%. Ana and Sombra were also very common picks, but it's worth asking about selection bias here. After all, while it's been a while since I was a Sombra-specific creator, or even an Overwatch-specific creator, I guess, I did still bring in a lot more Sombra mains than the average Overwatch content creator would probably have, so it makes sense that they might be overrepresented in this survey. Some might also argue that the fact that I have 39 bottoms and 35 verses compared to just 7 tops also indicates something about my audience's breakdown. But nonetheless, we persist. After all, what about the characters people actually want to play? We have all been in the position where we've had to play characters out of obligation, but I also asked my respondents 2 other questions. Who is their main that they would pick if they were given total control over a team comp and could pick whoever? And who is their favorite character, however they choose to define that? And here we see something really interesting to me. For one, the Mercy portion drops massively here. She is still the most common main across all groups except for heterosexuals and tops, none of whom self-declared themselves as Mercy mains, despite 20% of heterosexuals and 14% of tops having her in their top 3. However, even among groups who played her way more, she's still not really a majority pick of any group. The highest is cis women at 46%, but even then, that's not particularly high given that nearly 70% have her as their most played. When we look at favorite heroes, it's even more dire for her. She went from 29% of everyone's most played heroes to 16% maining her and less than 4% declaring her as their favorite. To me, this really emphasizes that the prevalence of Mercy on this survey truly does come down to obligation. She is a consistent, powerful support who's been in the game since day 1. She is very strong, and especially at lower ranks. She brings a damage boost, she brings mobility, she brings resurrection as one of the single most powerful non-ult abilities in Overwatch, ever since it was reworked out of being her ult, and multiple Overwatch heroes like Pharah and Ashe have functionally required her to pocket them in order to become overpowered at various points in the game's lifespan. We can see when asked to pick mains, people diversify a lot. Ana, Lifeweaver, Sombra, and Symmetra are the other heroes that clear 5% on that question. And when it comes to favorites, Ana, Lifeweaver, Sigma, Sombra, Symmetra, and Venture all cross 5% as well. Mercy is undeniably popular. It's honestly shocking that she was never really made a mascot of Overwatch in the way that Tracer, or even Soldier, or Sojourn have been. But she has always been very popular. The very first Halloween event saw people going absolutely fucking feral over Witch Mercy, and she's always occupied a place of prominence in the hearts and minds of Overwatch fans. In this study, she's played by a huge amount of players. But there's obviously still a disparity here, and it's worth asking why. One major factor is that, while Mercy is indisputably strong, particularly during certain metas, not everyone wants to play her. The support role is often shuffled onto women in games in the same way it is in real life, and I think it's especially telling that so many groups who have her high in their playtime really don't feel that strongly for her when they get to express their personal preferences. It's also worth remembering that Overwatch, particularly in its early days, was one of the first FPS games that a lot of people played, and given that women are less likely to be gamers in general, especially in this genre, for a lot of complicated reasons relating to people not welcoming women into gaming spaces and it being less likely that they would have grown up playing those games, it wouldn't be impossible to theorize that if this game brought a lot of women who hadn't played many games before into the genre, many of them would gravitate towards a hero who is both powerful and mechanically easy to learn compared to more complex ones. That's not to say she's easy to be good at, to be clear, but just that compared to Widowmaker or Genji, people who are starting out in first-person shooters in general are going to be more likely to pick Mercy because it's easier to have an impact without needing to rely on mechanical skill you haven't developed yet. Also, to be clear, it is worth remembering that women were not the only group who picked Mercy. Everyone did. Like, they may have had higher rates, especially for cis women, but it really speaks to something about the character that everyone played a lot of her, but only certain groups get kind of labeled as Mercy groups. You know what I mean? And we also shouldn't treat any group here like a monolith. It was very rare to see any group experience anything resembling a singular consensus here. I mean, for the most part, even though there was an obvious preference for Mercy in terms of playtime, there genuinely is a lot of diversity among the heroes that people connected with, played, felt like they mained. Mercy was one of the first healers in the game in a role that has always been tiny relative to the interest in playing it, and has consistently been one of its strongest members. Even beyond her, support is also just a popular role. The strongest consensus in the survey so far has been that it was the most preferred role by far, and that tank is the least preferred. It's also worth asking about cause and effect in all of this. Do you like playing a character because of their role, or do you like playing a role because of the characters in it? Do you like DPS because you play Sombra, or do you like Sombra because you play DPS? And what's more, what about the other variables here? It's probably worth acknowledging that women dramatically preferred female characters to male characters, whereas trans men were pretty strongly biased in favor of men. Interestingly, cis men seem to be the least consistent in all of this, but that's where we can get into the statements about polarization. Like I said, we can't deep dive into every single statement here because this video is already going to be abominably long, but we'll pick some notable ones. For example, statements 1 and 2 were about male and female characters respectively, and for male characters, the only groups positively polarized towards playing men were trans men and tops. If we break it down into intersecting groups, we can see even more dynamics at play. For example, while most cis men were pretty neutral about playing male characters, it was actually heterosexual men who were most polarized against it, with gay and bisexual men being more in favor. By contrast, and perhaps unsurprisingly, were trans women who were uniformly negatively polarized by a character being male. We can also see this happen in reverse with female characters, where trans men were the only group at large who were neutral about them. However, the same dynamic doesn't exist among cis people. While cis men were pretty ambivalent about male characters and cis women were pretty negative about it, both cis men and women were positively polarized towards female characters. What's more, we can't even argue this is about sexual attraction. Homosexual cis men were pretty close to true neutral on playing men, while homosexual trans men were one of the more positive groups, and then that wasn't reflected by homosexual women, either trans or cis, when it came to playing women. Meanwhile, women who were attracted to men felt really no affinity for male characters that would justify making that argument. What's more, statement 3 was about ambiguous gender. And in that group, cis men were the only group that skewed neutral. Everyone else was super on board with gender ambiguity. Being cis was largely a neutral factor, and being trans was a pretty positive factor among everyone except for cis men. And not cis het men like you might assume. It was particularly among cis male homosexuals, bottoms, and verses. And somehow, despite that being pretty disappointing, it's not actually as shocking as it feels like it should be. Heterosexuality was neutral, skewing negative for everyone except for queer trans men who identified as tops, bottoms, or verses when asked. Remember, this part of the survey doesn't include anyone who opted not to identify their position, which is why there's sometimes some weird outliers here. Queerness was a positive for everyone except for 4 groups: cis straight men, which is the least surprising thing in the world, but also cis male pansexuals and asexual tops for some reason, which was more surprising. All 3 of those groups were neutral, and the only outright negatively polarized group here is, shockingly, non-binary pansexuals. Sometimes data doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense. Getting to morality, people were generally pretty positive towards evil people, neutral towards good guys, and big fans of morally gray characters. Being lawful was neutral, skewing negative, being chaotic was pretty strongly skewed towards positive, and moral flexibility was also pretty positive. When it comes to professions, I asked about a few general categories: mercenaries, soldiers, and scientists/doctors. People were pretty meh on mercenaries, very positive about the scientists, doctors, and other non-combat roles, and were very negative about soldiers. Something I did find interesting was that cis het men are not only the single largest subgroup of respondents, but were also one of the few to be neutral on this particular question. Contrast that with gay and bi cis men, who were very negative about it by comparison. Heterosexuals as a whole were the only group whose overall rating here was in the orange. Everyone else was pink or red. When it comes to wealth, people generally felt negative about rich people and neutral about the poor. Similar to the earlier questions about morality, I also asked about whether or not they were generally a good or bad person, not just part of a good guy or bad guy group. And interestingly, the responses were reversed. People like evil people, but they want them to still be good people. They like bad guys, but not bad guys, apparently. To round out the Overwatch segment, we have the sillier questions: girl bosses, boy failures, girl failures, baby girls, house husbands, and male wives. These characters don't have to be boys or girls to qualify here, because some men are baby girls and girl bosses, and some women are boy failures. If you don't understand the distinction between them, I don't know how to explain it. Anyways, broad strokes here are that the people love girl bosses. Shocker of all shockers. Boy failures, interestingly, were most popular among trans men, cis women, and NBs. But when it comes to girl failures, NBs fell back a bit, and trans women were a lot more positive. Similarly, trans men, cis women, and NBs like a baby girl character, whereas really only homosexual men want a house husband. Speaking of, another interesting split here is actually with house husband versus male wife. 2 terms that sound like they have similar appeal because, in theory, they're pretty synonymous. But while cis gay men were the only ones who seemed really interested about the former, the latter appealed to everyone except for trans women and heterosexuals. What's more, it's not even cis het men who didn't like the male wife characters. It was straight trans women who dragged the heterosexual polarization here into the negative. Potentially even more interestingly, the strongest support for a male wife character came from cis women. So, to summarize what we've learned here, people don't want to play men unless they're a male wife, whatever that means, but they really want to play women, especially if they're girl bosses. More seriously, the responses sometimes fell down pretty predictable lines. Trans men, cis women, and trans women are pretty likely to be negatively polarized against playing a character of the opposite sex, although the same doesn't really hold true for cis men. This brings me to a question I probably should have asked and regret missing, which is whether or not it mattered to you that you found the character sexy. A lot of video game discourse revolves around whether or not the female characters are hot enough for a presumed cis-het male audience, and I would have been curious to see how that would have skewed things here. When it comes to Overwatch, I think you could argue that that plays a pretty sizable role. The Gooners have been part of this fandom from day one after all, but I also think that it's interesting that cis-het men don't really seem to have a particular affinity for their own identities in general. They might be negatively polarized towards other identities in some scenarios, but for the most part, their preferences weren't particularly different from everyone else. The exceptions were some of the responses that you could argue raised a power dynamic question for them. Things like being a soldier in a military or being relatively less on board with girl bosses than most. But even then, the preferences weren't really that far off. My theory would be that they're just a lot more used to getting to play characters that they feel represented by, so it's not going to stand out as much when one does identify like them. Like, I remember when I played Mortal Kombat, I immediately became a Kung Jin main after he was outed during the game's story in Mortal Kombat X. But if you're a straight boy playing that same game, you're kind of spoiled for choice for straight male characters if you really want one. Or at least one's presumed straight. The art says otherwise, but neither here nor there. It would make sense that when cis-het men are being asked about how they feel playing straight or cis characters, they would be relatively neutral. Even if they do have a preference for them, they have so many options when it comes to that, it's sort of like asking a fish if it likes swimming in water. Like, how's it supposed to contextualize that question? When I was first going through these results, my biggest takeaway was just that I had expected people to be more radically different. And sure, it's not that there weren't differences, but people weren't motivated particularly strongly in opposition to one another for the most part. More often than not, it was a question of how strongly individual groups were being positively or negatively polarized relative to one another when they were all mostly trending in the same direction. The strengths of various preferences varied, but a lot of these factors, both in the polarization statements as well as role and hero preferences, were a lot more unified and consistent than I would have anticipated. There weren't a bunch of questions where cis-het men were radically at odds with trans lesbians or something. People were a lot more similar than they were different. And sure, some of that absolutely comes down to selection bias as well. It's not a shock that, in order to end up in my audience and be invested enough that you're willing to fill out this survey, you probably are more tolerant of queer people than the average person. The demographics alone demonstrate this. While cis men were the largest group, and cis-het men in particular were the largest subgroup, they weren't bigger by much. Meanwhile, there were literally no heterosexual women who responded to the Overwatch side of things, and nearly as many non-binary people as both trans and cis women altogether. These demographics indicate that these responses don't necessarily reflect the reality of the broader public, but they do indicate that it's still possible to find a pretty diverse group of people in terms of identity who are able to share some common ground about loving some good old-fashioned gaslighting, gatekeeping, and girl bossing. This is interesting enough to me as it is, and I'll include a link to the Google Sheets if you want to review these numbers for yourself as well. But this is only the first half of the study. What about the Marvel Rivals side of things? Part 3. Let's talk Rivals. When it comes to Rivals, every question was basically the same, just substituting terms and characters for their Rivals equivalents. The biggest difference here is that it's just a smaller group. More of my respondents played Overwatch than Rivals. Rivals is also just a newer game in general, and some characters were brand new when the survey came out, like Ultron, so that will also skew things compared to Overwatch, which is nearly a decade old at this point. Anyways, for role preferences, we can see that they hold fairly consistent from the Overwatch side of things. Strategist was broadly the most popular role, although not as popular as it was with Overwatch. Most noticeably, heterosexuals actually picked Vanguard as their preferred role, as did trans men, which is kind of shocking to me. Pansexuals were tied between Duelist and Vanguard, and Tops were a three-way tie on first preferences. Second preference was, again, a pretty even split with a preference for Duelist, although interestingly the least preferred role was nearly dead even between Duelist and Vanguard. Strategist is the most popular role, similar to Support in Overwatch, but interestingly Duelist is relatively less popular this go around. When it comes to character preferences, Cloak and Dagger are running up the score basically across the board for most played, except for, again, the heterosexuals. 2 games in a row the most popular character is a healer, and twice in a row the heterosexuals are the exception on playing them. Notably, their most played character is still Luna Snow, so they're still in the strategist camp, and arguably they're picking the bigger diva character here. Not gonna lie, I would have assumed the gays would play more Luna Snow than this. When it comes to second most played, we can see every group other than heterosexuals maxing Luna Snow out though, and on third most played we see it spreading out even further. An important detail to me here is that Rivals doesn't have the same degree of consensus around any one character the way Overwatch did. And, it's not like Overwatch had consensus either. Mercy dominated through these questions, but in Rivals, it's just a lot more scattered in general. Different heroes topped the roster in different questions, and in general, it was just a lot more spread out. Interestingly, it's the opposite deal when it comes to people maining a character. Cloak and Dagger topped the chart at 18.22%, which Mercy was actually a little bit under at 16.38%. Also, unlike Overwatch, Cloak and Dagger are a lot more liked when it comes to favorite characters. However, again, we should look at the big picture here. Favorite characters don't require playtime or even a preference for their playstyle, which is reflected in how Iron Fist is the second favorite character, but literally no one said they mained him. Rivals is also complicated by the fact that all of these characters predate the game itself in some way. Your favorite Marvel character isn't limited to this one game. They might come from a comic or a movie or TV show or other game that they appeared in prior. You might like them as a result of those things. The performances of those characters will skew how people feel about them here, and it's very possible that people will have affinities for characters that don't match their engagement in this specific iteration because they don't line up with how they like to see them portrayed. As well, this game has opened up some possibilities for greater interaction between characters who might not interact very often, whether due to being new like Luna Snow or just being in radically different parts of the Marvel continuity most of the time. It also must needs be remarked that Rivals does, in fact, make some pretty hot characters, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the Iron Fist favorability saw spikes when it came to favorites, not necessarily related to how much people wanted to play him. However, let's get to the polarization statements and see what people said there. On gender, things were fairly consistent. Nobody except trans men really felt a positive polarization towards male characters, everyone but trans men were positively polarized towards female characters, and gender ambiguity was fairly positive as well. Being cis was mostly neutral, and being trans was broadly positive outside of cis men, particularly, again, cis gay men. Heterosexuality was neutral, skewing negative for literally every single group, which I think is the first time we've actually seen that, while queerness was a universally positively polarizing force here outside of a couple neutral subgroups. Not only is this a more positive response in the Overwatch ones, but heterosexuals were slightly more positive with Rivals than with Overwatch. And I think this is especially notable because Overwatch has gay people. Rivals, as far as I'm aware at least, doesn't have any confirmed queer characters. Or at least not within the context of Rivals, you know what I mean? Like, other iterations of these characters might be, and there's certainly a lot of shipping for a lot of them, but not in the same way that Lifeweaver and, Baptiste are. On morality, evil was once again favorable, but only slightly, and being good was pretty neutral. Moral ambiguity was also very positive in this group, lawfulness was neutral skewing negative, chaoticness was pretty positive, and flexibility was very positive just about across everyone. Career-wise, mercenaries continue to be unpopular outside of, surprisingly, cis women, who are also the only group to have a positive perception of soldiers in organized armies. Cis men, who are the exception to the rule for these questions on Overwatch's side, are actually pretty strongly against them, including heterosexual men. Non-combat was, again, very popular here as well, pretty much across the board. Wealth was negatively polarizing for literally everyone except for straight trans women, while poverty was actually very neutral here. Being a good person continues to be popular, and being a bad person is mostly pretty neutral. On to the sillier questions, girl bosses continue to be very popular with the exception of trans men. Boy failures are generally pretty neutral with the exceptions being trans and cis women who are negatively and positively polarized respectively. Girl failures were generally more positively polarizing, whereas baby girls were actually fairly divisive. House husbands and male wives were, by contrast, pretty similar in this one to one another, whereas with Overwatch there was more of a divide. We're rushing through the rival side of things a bit more because at this point you already kind of know how I'm going to interpret these details and what takeaways we can have from some of this data. Personally, the most noticeable detail for me was seeing how gender flipped on a few notable questions, namely around soldiers and mercenaries. With Overwatch, cis men were the positively polarized exception for soldiers, whereas in Rivals it was cis women who also were positive about mercenaries. As well, I wonder how much it affects things that I myself am not a big Rivals creator. I've used Rivals footage and I've streamed plenty of it, and I'm actually part of their partner program thing, but while Overwatch and characters like Sombra were once a big part of what I do, Rivals has never really been like that for me. In a sense, I imagine that this gave me a more representative sample population of the average Rivals players in some ways. The other reason we're kind of rushing through this is because I want to actually dig deep into the data from both games at this point, so that's what we're going to do. Part 4. Let's talk about gay people. Like I said, these sheets will be made available through a link in the description, and I'd encourage you to read through them yourself if you want to analyze the responses a bit deeper. I would especially encourage checking out the differences between the games when analyzing the same group, such as comparing how homosexuals responded to Overwatch versus Rivals. There are literally hundreds of points of data in this survey, and one of the challenges of trying to analyze any of it is that it's really easy to read too deeply or not deeply enough into any one aspect. It is also really easy to forget that while some groups had a large enough response rate that the numbers could be meaningful, some of them really didn't. There were very few trans men, cis women, pansexuals, or tops in either group, and some groups that would be larger in a representative sample of the general population, namely cishet men and women, were definitely not proportionally represented here. This is especially important to remember when it comes to analyzing the responses of subgroups. On each of the polarization statement sheets, you can see the number of people in each group in the weights portion of the sheet, and a lot of those are just very small groups. For Overwatch, there were 0 respondents in the following subgroups: ace trans men, pan trans men, trans women tops, cishet women, cis women tops, non-binary straights, verse straights, and pansexual tops. There were also 5 or fewer respondents in the additional subgroups: trans men who are gay, straight, bisexual, top, bottom, or verse, cis men who are asexual, pansexual, or tops, trans women who are gay, straight, bisexual, or pansexual, cis women who are gay, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, bottoms, or verse, NBs who are pansexual or tops, homosexuals who are tops, heterosexuals who are either tops or bottoms, and asexuals who are tops. For Rivals, there were 0 respondents in the following subgroups: trans men who are bisexual, pansexual, or bottoms, cis women who are straight, pansexual, or tops, NBs who are straight people who are verse, and pansexuals who are tops. There were also 5 or fewer respondents in the additional subgroups: trans men who are gay, straight, asexual, tops, or verse, cis men who are asexual, pansexual, or tops, trans women who are gay, straight, bisexual, pansexual, tops, bottoms, or verse, cis women who are gay, bisexual, asexual, bottoms, or verse, NBs who are asexual, pansexual, tops, or verse, gays who are tops, straights who are tops or bottoms, bisexuals who are tops or bottoms, asexuals who are tops, bottoms, or verse, and pansexuals who are bottoms or verse. In addition, trans men as a whole and rivals only constituted 4 total respondents. Now, why am I only mentioning this now? Well, in part because our analysis up to this point has kind of glazed over this fact, and I think a lot of people will have also not really realized how much I was deliberately doing that. I mean, I referenced it a couple of times, but didn't really hammer home on it, did I? Not to ruin the magic or anything here, but with all my study videos, the goal isn't really to actually derive something that is unquestionably true about the topic on a scientific level. Rather, it's more to try and teach people about how studies and data work. And that's for a few reasons. For one, I don't have the reach or institutional capacity to do a true, proper study with an appropriate sample size, and so these are always just pilot studies that are indicative of something that might be interesting to learn more about, but aren't definitive in and of themselves. The goal of a pilot study isn't to definitively answer the question, but to test the waters and see if there might be something worth diving deeper into. If there's smoke, that might justify looking for a fire. The reason this is important to understand is that whenever you see news about a new study that says X, Y, or Z, it's important to check and see what kind of study it is. Is it a full study or is it just a pilot? What were the sample sizes? What was the methodology? What takeaways should you get from it as a result? And what should you be tempering those takeaways with? The specific goal of this study video and how it's been presented has been to demonstrate one key thing. Namely, how easy it can be to construct a narrative about a group of people out of data, especially if you underrepresent them, either accidentally or deliberately. I didn't actively seek out respondents of any particular identities, nor did I exclude respondents who didn't match my narrative. However, this is very easy to do as well and get away with, particularly if there's not appropriate peer reviewing going on. Research and the scientific method are not morally neutral nor morally pure. They are tools just like any other, and it is very, very easy, particularly with very small marginalized groups, to use them to dress up a false narrative with scientific legitimacy. This is particularly true when it comes to research surrounding queer people, especially trans people, who are often so small as a group that any study that's conducted without a real understanding of how to reach a representative sample of us will almost always skew to the extremes. A really easy example of this is Ray Blanchard's research into trans people, which is one of the most egregious instances of using bullshit science conducted by a moron to justify bigotry towards queer people. For the unfamiliar, and I apologize in advance for discussing this, Blanchard's claim to fame is his transsexualism typology, a bizarre theory that posits that trans women are categorized into just one of 2 groups of people: homosexual transsexuals, who Blanchard posits are just feminine gay men that transition with the goal of attracting men, and autogynephilic transsexuals, who are men that are sexually aroused by the idea of their own body being female. These are terms that I'm not going to use throughout the rest of this video because they're pretty shitty, but unfortunately, bad science has a way of codifying itself in a way that requires it to be addressed as its creator determined until such time that the institutions change. This research is complete bunk, only managing to tread water for so long because Blanchard refuses to acknowledge the mountain of data that contradicts his research or the testimonies of trans women themselves. He basically never actually considers the reality that trans women might just identify as women. He always assumes that there's some sort of deeper motivation going on there. He also takes the pushback that he gets from a lot of trans women who say that his research is bullshit and is poorly conducted as more proof that he's actually right, because they're defensive. Their male egos are getting in the way of science. It's a bigoted, shitty worldview. His research, in the loosest possible air quotes, became especially prominent though thanks to Michael Bailey's 2003 book, The Man Who Would Be Queen, which is also just a poorly written hack job that manipulates the narratives of trans women, cherry picks their life stories, and comes to some absurd conclusions about not just trans women, but basically all queer people by proxy. The thing is, when you're talking about such small marginalized groups, it's very hard to find people who are interested in talking to you, and it is very easy to find people who live on the fringes to exploit for your narrative. Remember what I talked about near the beginning. You can effectively tip off respondents by unintentionally phrasing a question in such a way that it removes certain respondents from the equation. For example, if I asked, "Do you play Mercy for the gameplay?" I would have almost certainly affected how Mercy players perceived my study, because they'd be more likely to interpret that as me trying to take a dig at them, and they're more likely to either respond defensively and quit the survey. Compound this with the reality of who plays that character. This would have likely meant that significantly fewer cis women would have responded to my survey, because that was the largest contingent of people who played Mercy, and are the contingent of people who are also derisively referred to as Mercy mains, or are boxed into that group. This is a bad thing that you're trying to avoid if you're trying to get an honest representative sample, because it disincentivizes people to respond and stops you from getting a more accurate sample.
People like Blanchard do the same thing by creating surveys, again, air quotes, that are deliberately built to filter out people who have stories that don't line up with their narratives. If trans women encounter the question, would you describe your sex life as autogynephilic, then they're going to probably stop responding unless they really trust that survey's creator, meaning that you'll only get a very, very small handful of people who would categorize their own sexuality like that, which, yes, some people do. It is an incredibly small number, but there's always somebody out there. And if you want to find a way to cherry pick respondents rather than cherry pick data, that's how you do it. It's also very easy to use isolated data points to pathologize behaviors that are otherwise pretty consistent. The idea that trans women are doing something weird by wanting to have sex in a body that correlates with their gender identity when that would never be seen as a weird behavior for a cis person is one of those things. It's an example of pathologizing behavior that would be considered normal in a different context. For example, I'm sure that Blanchard and Bailey would have some thoughts and opinions about the desires of trans women to play as female characters in video games that have been expressed in this survey, as well as their affinities for girl bosses. They could easily isolate that data and argue that the strong preference trans women have for these attributes supports their theories, that trans women do it for personal gratification, a fetishization of the desire to inhabit a female body that manifests as a desire to embody not just a woman, but a woman who is defined by a characteristic that could be associated with things like dominatrixes, and from there you could make a sexual inference. This would of course be a fucking ridiculous takeaway from all this. Trans men and trans women both have a strong preference for their respective genders, and have a pretty logical negative polarization towards the notion of embodying a character who is at odds with their gender. What's more, the trends of trans women throughout the study intersect with basically every other group at one point or another, aligning with a lot of them, but never being a direct one-to-one. Blanchard's theory would suggest that the mentalities of heterosexual transgender women and homosexual cisgender men should align far more than they do, and that homosexual transgender women wouldn't really align with anyone, as his typology posits that their sexuality is uniquely self-centered, that they are women because they're sexually attracted to the notion of being a woman above all else and fetishizing the female body as part of that. Again, this isn't the case. You could cherry pick the data to find specific responses that could be manipulated to support this narrative, but taken as a whole with the context of how everyone responded, there's not really an argument for this. The similarities and differences between trans and cis people in this survey are pretty easy to understand without having to resort to debunked pseudoscience about how trans women are trans because they get turned on by the idea of being a woman or something. While this pilot study is absolutely not conclusive by any stretch, it does achieve what it set out to do. Namely, to demonstrate that preferences for roles, characters, and attributes are affected by identifiers including gender, sexuality, and sexual positions. It is also important not to read this data in the opposite direction either, to interpret the differences between trans and cis men and trans and cis women as proof that trans men aren't real men, or that trans women aren't real women because the views, values, and perspectives of those groups are different. Men, cis or otherwise, did not present a unified front on this survey in general, and neither did women. The easiest example of this is that question about soldiers. When it came to Overwatch, cis-het men felt noticeably less negative about them than gay cis men, with bi-cis men falling in the middle. Straight trans men were extremely negative about it by contrast, while gay trans men were less negative than their cis counterparts, and bisexual trans men were more negative than theirs. Gay trans women were dramatically less negative than their cis counterparts, which I guess you could argue kind of aligns with cis-het men, but then both cis and trans bisexual and asexual women were pretty aligned. Contrast that with rivals, and it gets even more confusing. Cis women were at a 2.38 for Overwatch, one of the lowest group responses to the question, but for rivals, they were 3.1. Literally the only group to trend more positive than negative across both groups. When it comes to subgroups, both straight and gay trans women had the same response, and bisexual trans women were unified in ranking it as low as possible. Cis women, meanwhile, were neutral or positive across all subgroups, whereas across all of their gender identity subgroups, the only other positive response came from cis male tops. The point of this study wasn't really to prove that bottoms be playing Mercy or whatever, although incidentally, this survey does suggest that the correlations we make between gender, position, and sexuality are more of a constructed narrative than a reality. When it comes to preferences regarding roles, my takeaway is that demographics actually affect it far less than I would have anticipated. Most people, regardless of identity, preferred playing support/strategist and disliked tank/vanguard the most. Different groups swung more heavily in favor of these trends than others, and a couple of them were exceptions, but the exceptions to those trends were rare. When it comes to heroes, my takeaway is that people's playtime doesn't really necessarily reflect who they want to play a lot of the time. Otherwise, everyone in the Overwatch survey would have been putting themselves down as Mercy mains. Beyond that, the fact that playtime and maining didn't really correlate as strongly with favorite characters as I would have expected suggests that there's a third dimension here. That who you play the most, who you consider to be your main, and who you actually like the most as a character are really three distinct questions that need to be understood separately in order to actually understand the subjects. 69% of cis women said Mercy was their most played, but only 46% consider themselves Mercy mains, and only 15% said she's their actual favorite character. 38% of cis men had Mercy in their top 3, but only 10% said she's their main, and none said she was their favorite. Bottoms put Mercy at 43% for most played, but only 23% main her, and 5% consider her their favorite character. This is interesting enough as is, but the really cool piece of data to me is that when you look at each demographic, you notice something weird. Namely, that most groups have pretty sharp disparities between how they respond to those three questions, with two notable exceptions: cis men and heterosexuals. Given that the overwhelming majority of heterosexual respondents were cis men, 22 out of 27 for Overwatch and 12 out of 15 for Rivals, I think it's worth reckoning with the fact that this specific demographic seems a lot more likely to actually play the characters they want to play, whereas the other groups seem like they have to play characters that they don't want to as much. This trend is stronger with Overwatch than Rivals, particularly when it comes to favorite characters, which I think probably comes down to what I mentioned earlier about Rivals characters coming in with pre-existing biases thanks to predating their actual games, whereas Overwatch is just a lot more self-contained. However, to me, this suggests that cishet men are statistically more likely to actually pick the characters they want to play and get to pick those characters, whereas other groups are more likely to be pushed off their favorites onto other characters out of necessity. This is anecdotally something that can be seen pretty frequently in games in my personal experience. If a woman or someone who sounds gay talks in a lobby, they're a lot more likely to get told to get off DPS and go play Mercy or something. And if everyone wants to play DPS, those are the groups of people who are a lot more likely to eventually be pushed into doing some supporting. The notable exception to this appears to be surrounding tanks and vanguards, where it seems like cishet men are a lot more likely to both enjoy playing the role and also like those characters. My guess is that this correlates to something that I talked about in the companion video to this one, about how we associate support with femininity, whereas DPS and tank are both generally more associated with masculinity. The healer versus the hunter versus the protector. However, in order to avoid repeating myself across two separate videos, I'd suggest watching that one if you want to hear more about that side of things. For our purposes, the reason I'm bringing this up is that data also exists within a context, and that the narratives we create can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Cis women playing a lot of Mercy is a common narrative and exists for a lot of reasons, the big one being the assumption that women aren't good at games and that Mercy is easy, so women play Mercy for that reason. However, if you believe in that narrative and the related factors, you're a lot more likely to assume that a woman you encounter in your games is less mechanically skilled and better suited to playing Mercy than a more mechanically intensive character, and that if she's not playing that character, then she's the reason why things aren't going well. Women will recognize that they're more likely to experience that kind of verbal abuse, blaming them for being in the wrong role or playing the wrong heroes if they're playing DPS, and so if you want to avoid it, you might just pick Mercy and or not speak. Then, the person who's expected to flex or fill to accommodate other players will inevitably get more practice with the characters they're expected to play, even if those aren't their favorites, and they'll get better with them. Then, especially if they play comp, they get trapped on that character. Their ability with that character is how they ranked up, and they're relatively less experienced with others, so swapping off of them is more likely to cause an L, which means they're incentivized to play them even more, even if they might not want to. They're then in a position to be dogpiled when things go wrong, because people frequently blame the supports for a loss regardless of what actually caused it. In large part because it's really hard to actually see whether your supports are doing a good job in the moment, which makes them an easy target for when things go wrong and you're looking for someone to blame. This is where two generally unrelated factors, namely the correlation between femininity and support and the tendency to blame the supports for losing, can combine to create a narrative. In this case, it would be that women play supports are the reason that we lose, therefore women play the role that causes me to lose. That must mean that they're bad. This is a tangent, but it's not a meaningless one. The point is that understanding data when we talk about this stuff is genuinely very difficult, and that it's easy to both read too much and not enough into what it's telling us. A study like this actually tells us very little by itself. It gives us a lot of reasons for why people like playing certain characters, what characters they play, what roles they prefer, and which characters they prefer. However, it doesn't grapple with the external factors that affect this stuff, and it doesn't really grapple with cause and effect. After all, there were some pretty substantial differences between Overwatch and Rivals responses that can't really be explained, which is especially noteworthy given that many of the respondents were responding to both surveys. To my mind, this begs the question of whether people responded to the polarization statements in a way that reflects their decision-making process when choosing the characters they want to play, or if it reflects that they picked characters for various reasons and then discovered or developed affinities for those attributes based on the characters they played. Do you like girl bosses and that's why you like Emma Frost? Or do you like Emma Frost and that's why you said you like girl bosses? Do you like Lifeweaver because you like playing fruity characters, or do you like fruity characters because you like Lifeweaver? Like I was saying before, the purpose of this video wasn't to determine once and for all if bottoms do indeed be playing Mercy. The purpose of this video is to demonstrate how easily data can be cherry-picked, and the difficulties in drawing meaningful conclusions from huge amounts of data, particularly when it comes to small groups of marginalized people. I'm hoping that your takeaway from this video is that whenever someone starts to claim to have some sort of data demonstrating some indisputable proof about some marginalized group of people, that you view it with a healthy dose of scientific skepticism. That when someone like Ray Blanchard starts talking about minorities in a way that virtually every person in that minority group disputes, and in a way that reflects more of an effort to reach a predetermined conclusion rather than actual scientific discovery, You start to question the motives, conclusions, and methodology used rather than believing what they say because they have the veneer of scientific legitimacy. Gender, sexuality, and position are all complicated in terms of how they influence our preferences for characters, clearly. Transphobic assumptions that correlate trans women to cis men or trans men to cis women clearly do not hold, as there are some noticeable differences between those groups throughout that wouldn't make sense if we assume that sex assigned at birth is immutable in terms of how it affects preferences, perceptions, and personality. Homophobic assumptions that try to do the same thing similarly fall short, and if you want to talk about positions, well, again, the companion video does go into that more. Again, if you want to look through the results yourself, I strongly encourage you to check it out. And when you find yourself reacting to certain pieces of data with, that's what I would or would not have expected, then I want you to ask yourself, why? Why would you find it predictable to see a certain group of people respond a certain way? Why would you find it surprising to see a certain group of people respond a certain way? One of the biggest challenges in data analysis is understanding just how deeply our pre-existing biases run, and not recognizing how they skew our analysis in ways that the data doesn't support. And hey, if you want to learn more about those pre-existing biases, I strongly encourage you to go check out How Queerness Moved from Horror to Healer, where I dive into that more deeply. And now is the perfect time to do so, because this video is over. Thank you very much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who participated in the survey as well. This video wouldn't have been possible without so many of you saying, you know what, sure, I will tell this twink VTuber about whether or not I enjoy girl bosses or boy failures, and I appreciate it a ton. Hopefully this video is worth the wait, and if not, well, got a few more coming up soon. Here's the schedule for the upcoming videos as of right now. September 7th, Elite beat agents in the games killed by changing console gimmicks. September 21st, mythical Pokemon were a bad idea that's only gotten worse with time. October 4th, the sequel makeover, how Overwatch handled updating its character designs, which will also be the beginning of the 3rd anniversary Donathon. October 5th, making a mascot, ruining a character. And October 12th, what it means to hate a game for content. There's also the process of elimination video, which will probably come out in late October, as well as the September and October members' choice videos, which will be out either in October or November, depending on what people pick. The other day I realized that in the time it took me to put out 9 videos in 2025, I'd put out literally double that in 2024, so I'm trying my best to crunch and catch up a bit before the end of the year. For the Donathon itself, I couldn't get the time off that I'd wanted to for October. Unfortunately, employment is a curse. So instead, the way it's going to work is that it'll be a capped Donathon starting on October 4th. And from the 4th to the 20th, I'll be doing regular streams while working on videos and also actually working. Then from the morning of the 21st to the end of the day on the 26th, we'll be doing 24/7 streams on Twitch with a bunch of, friends, associates, and other mentally ill gay people, I guess. I don't know. The specific schedule will be set up once I know what my work schedules are for those weeks, and the Donathon incentives will be up once I know what to do for any of them. Also, don't forget to pre-order your Wiggler pins if you haven't already. I mentioned it at the start and made a post about it before, but for Americans, this will be your only opportunity to get them for the foreseeable future. The shipping company that the artist uses has stopped shipping to America on account of the tariffs, so we're going to be doing a bit of a workaround to make sure you can still get your pre-orders, but it's one that I'm not going to be able to afford to continue doing beyond those pre-orders. Pre-orders are still open for everyone until September 5th, so if you really want one but haven't pre-ordered yet, make sure to do so ASAP. There's also the September Members' Choice video that starts tomorrow. The topics are how Buried Stars gets social media toxicity right. This video would be a return to Buried Stars, focusing specifically on how it portrays social media toxicity through its Twitter stand-in Fader, and how that toxicity impacts each of the characters differently. Why social skills actually matter in competitions. This video would explore how social skills work as both offensive and defensive tools in competitive environments, and why that's important. The content creator crisis of the commons. This video would explore how online content is a uniquely modern crisis of the commons, and how that impacts the relationships between viewers, creators, and content. Gen AI is a society-wide prisoner's dilemma, and we're not going to solve it in time. This video would be about the nature of the economic time bomb that is generative AI, and why the people with the power to defuse it are basically guaranteed to refuse to do so until it's too late. Memberships cost $5 a month through YouTube and Patreon, both of which are linked below, and voting for these topics will run from September 1st to September 10th. Last thing, but thank you very much to all of my channel members. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele and Robot Juice. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Angie Bailey Nichols, and Cavi Corbin. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Gavost, Crimson Cyclo, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Amon Dodley, Meep Cube, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku_, Safon, Lala the Bambi, JMD Toaster, Ginkgo, Teo Tamara, and Please Like Me. Whether you're a member, a subscriber, or just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.